Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining our program with our guest speaker, Professor Nadia Ahmad from Barry University. Our program is sponsored by the University of Houston Law Center, the European Union through the Marie Curie Actions and the Horizon 2020 program, and the EENR Center at the University of Houston, Environment, Energy, and Natural Resources Law Center. And next month, we're pleased to host another speaker, and that would be Professor Katrina Koo from Pace University on avoiding performative climate justice. So feel free to use the chat box for your questions, and also for further information, please visit our website, www.law.uh.edu/EENR-Center, where you'll find the upcoming events in the program, but also our archive, which is rich of the contribution of different scholars. So I'll now turn it over to Professor Gina Warren, co-director of the EENR Center and our chair this morning.
Thanks, Albert. I'm so happy to be here, and we're very lucky to have Professor Nadia Ahmad joining us today. She is the associate professor at Barry University School of Law. She has a JD from the University of Florida and an LLM from Denver. And her research explores the intersections of energy siting, the environment, sustainable development, and draws a lot on international investment law and corporate social responsibility. She's a prolific scholar and has published over 30 important scholarly articles and book chapters, one of which will be discussed today. And she's received multiple awards and accolades for all of her work in these areas. We are honored to welcome her to this webinar series to hear more about her timely work on transnational energy law regimes and systems dynamics and the Energy Charter Treaty, which is having a lot of crazy things happening right now. So I'm super excited to hear and learn. And so I will turn it over to you to get us moving. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gina. Thank you also, Aubin, for organizing this webinar series. It's really exciting to speak with you all today. And so today, my topic is looking specifically at the idea of transnational energy law regimes and systems dynamics. And so what I wanted to also look primarily at is how there is interlap between these areas of the law and specific portions of it. So I look at the International Renewable Energy Agency and the Energy Charter treaties and focus on the finance mechanisms of that. And so thinking about why all of this really matters is that the specific transnational energy law regimes that have been put in place have also grown at the same time as climate change adaptation measures. There was a recent study that was done in Nature, in the Nature journal, that said that we really have to limit 90% of future coal production and keep 90% of coal reserves in the ground to avoid runaway climate change, or even about 80% of global fossil fuel reserves cannot be used. And so if we're really being able to reach those numbers, we're not really seeing the law and policy working in that same aspect. And so at the same time as these developments are happening naturally for climate change adaptation, we have international treaties and agreements that have been put in place to form the basis and the bulk of energy law. And there's also a growing proliferation of transnational environmental intergovernmental organizations. And so they're offering work to create collaborations for international cooperation beyond simply what state actors are doing. So these are parallel movements that are occurring. And there's also a movement for private equity in terms of being able to develop green energy finances and develop renewable energy incentives at the national, state, and local levels to build a better transnational energy systems, working towards further collaboration. In the US, we've seen this in the form of the idea of Build Back Better. Build Back Better actually developed in Japan from the Sendai framework, and it was really a way to think about disaster recovery and how to respond following earthquakes in the Pacific, as well as how to respond to tsunamis. And so that same idea is thinking about extreme weather events and extreme catastrophic incidences that will lead to potential for transformation in the face of disaster. And so a lot of the energy policy that is developed not just in the US is focused on the price of oil and how to contain it. And quite a bit of energy has been focused on that. And we've also seen growth of renewables happening when there's specific stressors that are put on the price of oil. And so there's a discussion and debate about who actually is able to fix and set the price of oil. And so we see a lot of this development for renewable energy happening at the same time of the development of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which was founded in 1960 with 14 member states. And so as you have seen the development of oil economies and oil cartels, there's this fusion between whether or not there's control of natural resource sovereignty and what were some of the idea of Dutch disease or the natural resource curse. And so we're seeing at the same time concerns about climate change and if the price of oil and gas is going to be so low that fossil fuels, that renewable energy will not be able to compete. We're also seeing concerns about food security. Food security was one of the drivers of the Arab Spring, which was also driven by drought in the region. There's also concerns about labor disruptions and terrorism, as well as the ongoing natural disasters and this idea around peak oil and when exactly are we going to reach peak oil. When I started working in the oil and gas sector about a decade ago, that was when there was some discussion before about when are we going to reach peak oil. But as the time has gone by, we've developed more and more technology so that it's less difficult to extract the oil, and that it doesn't matter if there's conflict or other geopolitical turmoil. The technology is there, and as well as the political will to make sure that we're able to extract oil and natural gas in a way that can be provided to consumers. And so, but there are still all of these other concerns that are going to be brought forward. And we're also seeing as well is that as OPEC is formed, IRENA, which is the other organization that I will get into, many of you are probably familiar with the International Energy Agency. IRENA is a little bit of a contrast to both that as well as OPEC itself. So even though IRENA was developed essentially geographically in a similar location to OPEC. And so what OPEC really sought to do was to coordinate the petroleum policies of its members and to provide member states with technical and economic aid. And so both the Americas and the Europeans refer to OPEC as a cartel when it was really essentially formed as a union. To try to exercise natural resource sovereignty. And then there was also concerns when OPEC exerted a form of an oil embargo to exert political pressure, but all of that seemed to fizzle over time, especially as concerns for developing economic alliances took more precedence over developing like ethnic or religious alliances, which were more prominent at the time of its formation. And so a lot of these fault lines have really continued to intensify. And then during the post-World War in post-World War I and post-World War II, a period where we saw the formation of the Cold War, there was also at that time this idea circulating around the concerns for environmental activism. So a lot of these wars that were engaged in the 1970s and up through the 1990s were waged over oil. But going forward, future wars are going to be waged over water. And water is also going to be at a premium because there has been sea level rise. And so there's been going to be a decrease in fresh water and land as well. And so we really see the planet is at the same time shrinking and also warming at the same time. So in areas where you had seen bombs that followed oil and where drones are now following drought, there are concerns about climate change, financial crises, food insecurity, labor disruptions, terrorism, and these natural disasters. And so all of this is working together to create a toll worldwide. And so in an effort to really try to stabilize these uncertainties within these systems, as well as the concerns that people are having in the region, renewable energy really emerged as a way to improve development outcomes, as well as to conserve the planet, not only in the Middle East, but also worldwide. And so there was idea that if we develop renewable energy in the Middle East, we'll also be able to have a win-win proposition as opposed to looking at the win-lose realities of the world. And so IRENA was developed as a way to respond to this crisis. And so they were trying to flip the extraction narrative, but at the same time, they also wanted to preserve the maximization of oil output for Middle East drillers. And so there was also economic incentives for it in terms of, who is going to be able to set the price of oil. And so as the time horizon for OPEC starts to dwindle, it started to seek out ways to expand its power. And so it developed alliances with Russia and 10 other non-member countries to try to develop pacts for that. And so that is where the Energy Charter Treaty also came into play. And so OPEC's really shrunk its sphere of influence since its heyday in the 1970s. And at the same time, there is an increasing demand for electric vehicles and renewable energy technology. And so a lot of these fluctuations in oil prices that have occurred are based on complex factors. In 1998, the prediction for peak oil, if you can think about it, was actually 2004 to 2005. They said that in a little over 7 or 8 years, we're going to reach peak oil. And that is actually around the time frame that there was discussions developing for IRENA at the time. But the time frame for peak oil just kept expanding, kept getting pushed back further and further. And so we have big oil in the US, and we also have OPEC, who are trying at many ways to limit the transition to renewables, to make it gradual instead of make it rapid and accelerate as fast as possible. So IRENA, and I think pointing out this caution in terms of that is really important in terms of how fast and how rapidly there is a desire in the Middle East to tip the scales in favor of renewables. And there's also at the same time, there's an invisible hand of OPEC present as well to monitor the energy transition, so that they are also most invested and most leveraged against an explosive growth of renewables. And so that's really, I think, that the point I wanted to really highlight is about how we have this movement and balance that is developing towards having further expansion of renewables in terms of what the transition will look like. But there's also certain factors that are putting in place to limit that transition. And when we look at it from the perspective of climate equity, as well as how small island developing states are looking at it, there is not a concern of what will happen in the future. It is there are really dire situation right now that is occurring all across the world. And really for those who are more wealthy and have more resources are going to be able to ride that storm out in an easier way. And so as a part of that, you have small island developing states that are working to really lead the movement for renewable energy transition, well as for climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction. And this has also led to development for the loss and damage discussions for climate negotiations. And from this point of entry, we see systems dynamic as an important part of this discussion. And what systems dynamic does is it really offers a theoretical way to think about how to expand the targets that are put forward in the Paris Agreement, as well as overcome some of the problems with the Energy Charter Treaty. And I'll get into a little bit more details of the Energy Charter Treaty in a little bit, but I first wanted to kind of explain what systems theory considers. And so when you're looking at systems, you're looking at what is the overall interplay between different organizations at a macro and micro level, what will be the short, medium, and long-term impacts of those interactions. And so IRENA also comes into play as an intergovernmental organization that is going to seek to leverage capital to have more resilient energy systems. So there's a change that is happening in terms of being able to transition to renewables, but at the same time, it's important to see that the finance mechanisms are not always in place to make that transition happen. And when that transition is happening, the finance part of it is very important, because whoever is able to control the finance aspect of it will also control how rapidly that acceleration and change to renewables happens and at what rate. So IRENA is helpful for the idea of developing capacity building for finance mechanisms, but also noting that that IRENA developed following the global financial crisis of 2008, which we really saw peak in that period. And so in 2009 was when there was the first preparatory meetings for IRENA. And those were held in Germany. And then there was discussion at the time that the actual headquarters of IRENA would be in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, which is important because COP28 will be held there later this year. And so at the same time as we're facing this like massive global economic crisis, which really doesn't seem as large as compared to what happened during the pandemic. Right immediately after that, we saw a lot of currents of the Arab Spring that were also developing at the time to really lay bare some of the economic inequality as well as the gender apartheid in the region. And then as a part of that, system dynamics also shows you how, based off of these other social, economic, and environmental factors, there is a way to move forward and consider and re-examine how we think about energy governance and the idea of resilience. And so what systems theory is really kind of putting forward a way for developing renewable energy in a framework that will work, and also seeing that some of the older systems that had been primarily developed as Western legal tools may not be fully adequate to deploy the transition, especially within the global South, and that there's possibility that these are considered third world legal modalities that are developed from this idea of the third world approaches to international law may also provide an avenue for entry. And so this abstract concepts of complexity theory are also able to look at and consider how systems dynamics and how organizations function as a whole. So this is taking ideas from the business realm and deploying them into the energy sector specifically, and how you can develop public-private partnerships, and how to also leverage not only the finance but also the capital from the entrepreneurial work that is going to be done. So it's not as if this is just a large industry and needs to be put out there. There has to be research and development done. It's also thinking about how to move the idea of the renewable transition. So that has been really critical as well. And also thinking about this idea of resilience and what actually is resilience look like. So for me, resilience is going to look very different than how it would look to somebody in India or Pakistan or even in the Maldives. And so that idea of resilience is important. And I think it's important really to center the voices of not only minorities and those who are most vulnerable, but also looking at how so much of the world is living on less than $2 a day, and how for them their idea of resilience is going to be very different than how we see it. And so in the US, there are systems that are put in place, for example, to address flooding. In other countries, that isn't always the case. And when we're looking in terms of also how we're thinking about, what exactly is the way to move forward on this, we need to see as well as that the way these systems were designed were not designed to actually deploy renewables. So the whole field of energy law, as it stands, was developed to develop oil and gas and coal. And so there isn't going to be a push for developing a smaller sector of renewables, which only has a very small market share, even in the US, even with all of this effort that is being done because of the outsized influence of the oil and gas lobby, as well as the industry itself. And so how this idea of resiliency has to be reformulated is really important. So when I first started looking at the Energy Charter Treaty about 7 years ago, I was considering a really fine-tuning some of the issues in terms of how we could approach it, how to basically work around the Energy Charter Treaty as this hindrance to transitions, because there was international agreements that were coming forward, like the Paris Agreement. There was also the UNFCCC was putting forward new directives and initiatives that were occurring. And then at the same time, we had these old bulky systems of laws that were no longer working. And so the Energy Charter Treaty itself, which many people may not be as familiar with, really developed at the heels of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it was really a way to develop energy investment, exploration, production, and transport for oil and gas that is developed in former Soviet states as well as Russia. And so how to really make those reserves and those products, bring it out into other markets in a way that has less interference. And so the idea behind it was that if you have this treaty in place, it's going to benefit the investor country as well as the host country. But with most of these development agreements, the power dynamics are uneven, and so the host countries tend not to benefit as much from this relationship. And then there's also concerns as well as how you're going to not have rule of law implemented, because there's going to be arbitration agreements that there has to be, any disputes have to be resolved through an outside mechanism, through third parties, and it may not go through the court systems and also may not be public. But one of the things that happened during the pandemic is that it created a new framework. So for example, when I was sitting at home, I saw that there was these laws that were being put in place for $1 trillion in the US, $2 trillion, like massive pieces of legislation to stop the brink of economic collapse and public health disaster that was the pandemic. And so if we really want to see changes that are happening as a result of climate change, as well as the outsized influence of the fossil fuel industry, we're going to have to also think about the possibility of having these massive government interventions for adaptation. And so that's why when we saw the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as the bipartisan infrastructure law that was put in place, there was really unprecedented in terms of the US taking this amount of funding and putting it forward, especially in the face of really dire economic situation, because in the US we have really not thought about about the long terms of how we're going to be doing that. And so that's why I think it's really a possibility now, more than ever, that there will be a change. So things that you didn't think possible are going to start to happen. So, so in 2019, I actually went to San Diego and presented this paper on the Energy Charter Treaty, and I talked about how to change some of the provisions and how to respond to that. And then I started working on a book chapter from that article about a year and a half ago. And just as I was going through the final round of edits, a number of European countries, including Spain, decided they were going to withdraw from the Energy Charter Treaty. And that to me was just really astonishing, that they didn't even think about changing how they're going to respond and how the courts are. They're just going to say, you know, we're just not even going to, we're just going to bypass, we're just going to get rid of the whole treaty. And that to me was just like, I just didn't know how to respond to that. But then at the same time, if you think about it, in 1994, when you had the North American Free Trade Agreement that was put in place, it was a disaster all around. We lost jobs in the U.S. It impacted the price of goods in Mexico, and it really wreaked havoc on the system. And in 2022, when the Trump administration withdrew from NAFTA, I really started to think that, okay, maybe some of these treaties, international agreements, are not always going to work. And so the Energy Charter Treaty is one of those other international agreements that is more likely going to fall to the wayside. And so it's really interesting to be able to be speaking about something that is really at some point going to become historic, just like NAFTA has become. And so the real impetus behind the Energy Charter Treaty, or the ECT as it's known more, in its like energy law parlance, is that it's put out that it's going to promote energy efficiency and to mitigate environmental degradation, but that's not actually what it really does. What it really sets out to do is to have net energy exporting countries to achieve a way to attract investment, as well as to protect their natural resources, and also to ensure a more reliable transportation for their energy exports. And so at the same time, all these energy importing nations have to be able to obtain protection for the way that their outward energy investments and mechanisms are also going to encourage supply security. So not only do they want to be able to get the product, they also need to ensure supply. And so that's why that movement in international cooperation becomes very critical. So in the larger body of international laws, the Energy Charter Treaty is the only one that has set out international rules and regulations that are specifically designed for the energy sector. It also encompasses a really diverse range of countries across Eurasia, and it includes also energy producers, consumers, and transit countries. And so when it was really put in place, it was set up to put out for energy efficiency and mitigate environmental degradation, but that is really very far from what its main impact was. And so a lot of these enforcement mechanisms really vary across like the rules of the game. And so some of the institutions have put forward more formal compliance mechanisms, and others have relied on voluntary commitments and peer pressure to promote implementation of them. All of these mechanisms as well have also sought to foster implementation and enforcement, and they've also run into trouble if there's some concerns about sanctions, which we've also seen happening heavily as a result of Russia's war in Ukraine. And we're also seeing as well some of the incentives that are developed as a result of this. So a lot of the rules of the game to some degree reflect the realities of a Cold War era. And so that era is really characterized by significant increase in the discovery of stock supplies, and also by an occasional supply shocks. And so there's also been, over the past couple of decades, there's been an increasing conflict between producers producer and consumer nations. And this also following a period of decolonization and the formation of OPEC. And so there's been been responses that have been developed as a response to this geostrategic competition that is also emerging from the major supplier countries in not only the Middle East, but also Africa as a direct consequence of this great power conflict. And so these structures of the rules of this game also reflect these power differentials. And so this exclusive focus that has been put in place in terms of how energy resources are going to be considered is important, because you have to also consider what the dynamics are of international energy markets and how sustainability doesn't always become an issue at the forefront of that discussion. And so one of the issues that the Energy Charter Treaty does is it puts into discussion about how to use existing energy infrastructure, as well as look at how additional transportation capacity may not actually be sufficient. So the World Trade Organization has already had some experience with negotiating how rules for other industries are going to work, and this has happened in the telecommunications sector. There's also been some international trade that has been impacted by different types of transmissions, and so there's the concern about how to control the supply sector, but also the transmission sector as well, which the Energy Charter Treaty doesn't get into as much, but that's also something that's an important thing to consider. And so of the 50-some countries that were at one point a part of the Energy Charter Treaty, it was really developed to work with the European Union and the former Soviet states and Japan. And so there were specific non-derogation rules from the WTO that had been put in place and were really served as the cornerstone to the Energy Charter Treaty. And so the idea of having investment rules put in place and having this dispute resolution mechanism was really what was central to the Energy Charter Treaty. So even though they're putting forward this one idea, the real goal is to make sure that they can resolve disputes in a way that is beneficial to the investor countries. And so the idea and the concern about extraction dynamics is also really important to think about in terms of the infrastructure and what is happening for that. And so just before I kind of move on from this point, the Energy Charter Treaty really limits climate action. So a lot of critics at the time, they've said that this is a problem, especially if we want to go into specific types of climate adaptation measures. And so Natalie Bernasconi, who is an international lawyer and heads the Economic Law and Policy Program at the International Institute of Sustainable Development, has said that the Energy Charter Treaty attracted little public attention as a legal instrument and remains largely unknown. And there's also other NGOs, including the Corporate Europe Observatory, as well as the Transnational Institute. And they said the Energy Charter Treaty is the one treaty to rule them all, which is a reference to the Lord of the Rings. And so that it allows corporations to sue governments and has been responsible for multi-billion-dollar payouts of taxpayer money to energy firms. And the Corporate Europe Observatory has also put out a report saying that the ECT can also be used to lock countries into the use of climate-wrecking fossil fuels, shield disastrous energy projects from public opposition, and cement the power of big business over our energy systems. And so the report at the time warned that the Energy Charter Treaty is in the process of expansion, threatening to bind even more countries to corporate-friendly energy policies. And so the Paris Agreement, however, was serving as a counterweight to all of that. And since that time period, because of Russia's excursion into Ukraine, this has really led to a push away. And so the Energy Charter Treaty really is no longer an expansion, it's really in retreat. And so in terms of if we really want to think about how we can move beyond the Paris Agreement and really push the limits of what we're accepting in terms of the status quo, we also have to see that how the investment agreements have not only been designed to protect oil and gas development, also to protect the status quo of whatever is there in place and to keep that working the way it is. And so to really ensure ensure compliance with the Paris Agreement and to move to that next phase of accelerated and rapid transition, we'll have to move away from radical change of these types of international agreements, as well as the private systems and private agreements and contracts that are in place, which are separate from the Energy Charter Treaty. And so the really one of the most ambitious parts of the Paris Agreement is to have an obligation to elaborate and communicate nationally determined contributions in 5-year increments. The U.S. leadership on the Paris Agreement was very crucial in 2015, and it really helped to build a lot of momentum. During the Trump administration, we saw the U.S. pulling back quite significantly and retreating from its obligations under the Paris Agreement. And in fact, President Trump actually withdrew from or attempted to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And so law professor Uma Utka has said that this context of federal policy reversal creates an environment in which companies counterposing renewable energy goals stand out. And so you see that where one group is working in opposition to something, another group, when it's working in favor of maintaining the status quo, that becomes more prominent. And so the U.S. had still gone through this process of going through and working towards decarbonization. But during the Trump administration, we saw that there was movement away from this. The Trump administration, in fact, undid many of President Barack Obama's environmental initiatives, withdrawing the U.S. from the Paris Agreement, also rolling back regulations like the Clean Power Plan, and also most recently ending California's authority to set its own stricter fuel emission standards. And so as a result of that, we see the weakening of U.S. environmental laws. And that's why it's important to see where we are in the world and where other countries are in the world, and also where other international organizations are. And so if you see this broad array of international organizations in terms of what they do and how they're operating, we're really lagging behind as the United States in terms of where we fit into this. And so that's why you see emergence of initiatives like the International Renewable Energy Agency, which isn't really all that progressive or radical in terms of its approach to renewable energy, and developing more as a market player, and where countries are trying to reach out more to it and seek leadership from countries besides the United States. And so IRENA, when it was developed, was formed. It had about 100, close to about 170 representatives from 60 countries had convened in Berlin in April of 2008, and they had a subsequent meeting the year after. And the goal of the International Renewable Energy Agency was set up so that the world's first intergovernmental organization could be formed to focus on renewable energy. It had these 2 preparatory workshops, and then it convened about 100 representatives from about 44 countries to develop and create what was the founding treaty of IRENA. And so it also worked there to set up finance mechanisms, and a lot of the initial work was done at that time. And then in early 2009, IRENA was officially founded in Bonn, Germany. And then at the time, the governments really worldwide made it clear that these were specific commitments that were put in place for a global energy paradigm. And 75 states at the time signed on to the IRENA statute. And this was really the start of IRENA. And so IRENA was desiring to really put forward and promote the widespread and increased adoption of renewable energy, and also to inspire a really firm belief that vast opportunities were offered by renewable energy deployment, and that it was really crucial to have a low carbon economy. And all of that to also move forward. And so one of the things I really thought was interesting about IRENA is that it really didn't delve into the climate change debate. It basically just ignored it because it was still controversial and like in the US, Australia, and UK. And so basically just kind of worked forward and said, this is a market opportunity. This is about economic growth and sustainability, about jobs. And it really didn't delve as deeply into it. It didn't politicize the idea of climate change. And that's why I was really able to kind of develop it just kind of went about its business in terms of doing that work of developing it. And so I think that's an important lesson as well, both for the US and Europe in terms of how that is happening. And in the past week as well, we've seen a lot of countries withdraw from last year. Actually, a number of countries decided they were going to withdraw from the Energy Charter Treaty in Europe. And then this week, as well as earlier this month, there's been a discussion that the European Union itself will be withdrawing from the Energy Charter Treaty. And that will be a very major crack for the Energy Charter Treaty. And so it'll be interesting to kind of follow and watch that happening. And so I don't know how many have actually visited IRENA itself or the IRENA building. It's really set up as a really clean renewable energy to have a way to kind of stand out. And so it has really interesting architecture and construction for it. And one of the outputs of IRENA is that it develops renewable readiness assessments for different countries so that those countries can see what can be done in terms of being able to develop renewable energy plans and how to develop capacity, what are some of the different cost studies that can be done, because all of that requires upfront capital, which many countries may not have. It also works to have a roadmap put in place to double renewable energy worldwide by the year 2030, and to work to facilitate that. It works on energy planning and develops different types of technology tools that can then be used to leverage and obtain financing, either through private financing or through government support. IRENA has also set up a specific it's called the Global IRENA Global Atlas app. So you can download it on your iPad, or you can also use it on your computer systems. It's kind of an interesting thing. So if you kind of take away one thing from the talk today, you can see that the Global Atlas is really there and is something that can show you what type of renewable energy is beneficial to a certain region. It's really aggregated thousands of reports and data from a number of centers around the world, and really able to see, okay, this is where wind energy is optimal. This is where offshore wind works. This is where you can have different types of biomass. So I think that's really helpful because some of that work requires quite a bit of study, and it's really right there at your fingertips. And so as IRENA is happening, we saw the developments of COP21 with the Paris Agreement. And so IRENA is really convening like world experts and diplomats and technocrats. It's actually it's usually the first major international meeting after the COP that occurs in November, December time period, because the IRENA meeting is usually held in January. And so IRENA has also taken the windfall and propelled public-private partnerships in a really tight space that has been constrained by the demands of massive development banks, including the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And IRENA, unlike the International Energy Agency, is headquartered in Paris, was actually centralized in a global South energy hub of Abu Dhabi. And so Abu Dhabi itself is a country, or Abu Dhabi is a city that has served or developed an energy boon from petroleum, natural gas, and the latest developments, as well as in deep seabed drilling to liquefaction. And so the UAE has also served as an increasing tourist destination, but there's also this development and this idea that a lot of the Middle East drillers that have been out there and these sovereign wealth fund managers have also realized an economic paradigm that many of their other counterparts from extractivist industries have not seen, is that, or they really don't have the resources to conceptualize, is that the maximization of fossil fuel output also means resource conservation. So essentially, if they can conserve and save the oil and not use it themselves, they can then sell it to us. And so they're saving the oil for those who really, like ourselves, can't wean ourselves off of the oil. And so they've transformed a lot of the Arab energy grids to renewables, and they're also willing to sell the oil to whoever will pay the most price. But internally, they're just building out solar everywhere because they see that there's a cost tipping point that will be happening. And they've also hedged against American energy innovation. They've also funded environmental activism in the United States and Canada to limit production in the US. And essentially they know us better than we know ourselves, because they know that we're really going to seek out and crave every last drop of oil. And in conclusion, just to see is that a lot of the financial crisis that we have been undergoing is also a way to look at innovation, how we can think about new ways for investment as a way to combat uncertainty and the volatility that is present within energy markets, and think about, what are we going to do to respond to the increases in energy prices in a way that is equitable, fair, and just. And also, I think it's important to also see how the broader scope of how renewable energy projects are done from the beginning, in terms of the lending, from the lending aspects to the project management and development, as well as how there may be a possibility for refinancing mechanisms as well. And so all of that really leads to broader concerns about how to create national and subnational renewable energy policies that can lead forward to having further resiliency and sustainability, and seeing that the Paris Agreement isn't really the end, it's really just the beginning of what can be done to address deficiencies in international trade, and to respond to issues like the Energy Charter Treaty. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Professor. That was really interesting. And we really appreciate you coming to edify us as to what's going on. I find that this Energy Charter Treaty and everything that's going on with it is really interesting. And since I realized that I was going to moderate this panel, this discussion, I've been trying to catch up on it. And I think that it's interesting the way you compare NAFTA to it, and that both had basically have had seemingly failures due to their inability to evolve with the times, almost, right? And changing attitudes. And so a couple of things that I would love for you to expand on, if you could, is one of them is I saw that there were several cases that have come out, and that's what's really, precipitating this, the countries wanting to withdraw, and particularly the one in Spain. And I don't think that it'd be interesting if you could elaborate a little bit as to what the cases are and what the types of challenges that are going on, and why that this is a big deal. And you alluded to that this is, a lot of money, a lot of taxpayer money that's coming out because of this. And so it'd be great if you could talk about those cases just a little bit, just to give us a flavor of what's going on. And then the other question I had was, what I also saw is they were talking about modernizing this. And so there was a time where everybody was like, well, maybe we can just modernize this treaty. And maybe you could talk about what they were thinking might work, but it seems like that might not be moving forward now.
Right, thank you. Yeah, and so I think what I saw happening was that, and that was actually my original entry point, is that we need to modernize the treaty, that we need to make it amended in some ways and improve it. But then when I saw countries actually just completely withdrawing from it, that was really radical. And I thought I was being radical when I was saying you need to modernize it. And so I felt like I was kind of like taken aback by seeing that. What was interesting is that these cases, for them to even get to court, was actually in contradiction to the way the Energy Charter Treaty had been set up, is that a lot of these cases had to be resolved through the investor dispute resolution mechanisms that would go through private arbitration. And so this was the way that the treaty was put in place. And this was really a small provision, like the loophole within the treaty, to really benefit the oil and gas countries as well as the investor countries. And so, but when you also look at it from the perspective of like the extractivist paradigm, and how the countries that are having the oil and gas extracted from them, they always don't have the same negotiating tools, and even what they are given in response, whether it's through even community development agreements, may be very small in terms of what they are losing. And so just to kind of even moving away from Europe and just looking at Latin America in terms of what the big oil companies have done there, and countries like Ecuador and even in Brazil, the legal mechanisms in those countries and the rule of law are not able to respond to the pressure that happens. So there's also internal corruption that is happening at the government level, that there's bribes that are involved even on both sides, and how to respond to that, it's really difficult to. And so when you go back and look at the case in Spain, you see as well, like this case is developing in a response to arbitration disputes that weren't able to be settled. And so this is actually taking it outside even the realm of what was intended for the Energy Charter Treaty. And so as a result of that, many countries, they found that their obligations under the Paris Agreement and what they had put forward as their accelerated targets were not in line with what these dispute resolution techniques, which would require payouts by the government, which would be paid for by taxpayers. And so all of these cases were sort of like trickling in and happening at the same time. And then there's also this really growing like climate movement as well happening. And so that, as a result of that organizing, and I mentioned some of the different types of NGO that are looking at corruption and transparency, and a lot of these smaller outfits were actually providing the research and the concerns about what these loopholes were creating. And so they also there was like a whole process that was involved. So there's like what's happening in the court, but then there's also what's happening in the like the public space. So what is happening with the protests, the Fridays for climate strikes, and you also see a lot of development as a result of a lot of development of movement as a result of the pandemic. And so all of this is making people they reach this point where they're not going to accept certain situations in terms of this rapid deployment of oil and gas. And so this had actually, the concerns of when originally some of these countries had withdrawn was a little bit before the Russian excursion or invasion of Ukraine. This had happened, and then separately after Russia had gone into Ukraine, there was more dissatisfaction and less of an appetite for being able to appease this treaty. And the treaty had really kind of gone forward innocently, but at the same time, if you look at who is really behind in developing the treaty, I think that's really what has been problematic, is that there's like this hidden hand in what their separate agenda is and what they're touting. So nobody's going to really say that, I have a problem with energy efficiency, or I have a problem with developing resiliency, because that's really how it's sold. But on this other side, they basically create a loophole so that they can't go to court. And then when they are going to court in Spain, then they're losing. So basically it's defeating the purpose. And then they say, then they can still come back and say, we want to enforce the treaty because if you look at constitutional law in terms of like what has precedent, the treaty has a high level of precedent. And so they felt like their national obligation, as well as their own national security and environmental security, was at risk as a result of having to enforce those provisions of the Energy Charter Treaty.
Yeah, very interesting. In politics, I saw Switzerland, it looked like maybe is the only EU nation that's come out and said that they might not withdraw or want to withdraw, although they won't have a choice, I guess, if the EU withdraws and gets enough. Is that it? I saw that it's requires 15. Is that what it requires?
Yeah, and I think what's interesting, even with Switzerland's like neutrality, is that it isn't completely neutral. And then there's also, I was also reading another article that said like how long can Switzerland remain neutral, and like even with the war in Ukraine, like how long can they remain neutral on that? And so it's the same idea with the Energy Charter Treaty, is that they can really kind of drag their feet on this, but when the whole world is kind of moving in a different direction, then they also end up having to move with it. We also saw some of this happening last summer with the UN resolution for the right to a healthy environment. Switzerland always wasn't at the forefront in terms of moving the treaty forward, and it was only after the US and a few other countries had decided they were going to support it that we saw like other countries also coming forward. So I think in terms of like countries that are really working to switch their perspective as well as switch their positions, the US, I think is still respected in that respect, in terms of how, like, if it takes the position, it'll be respected, and others will also gravitate around it. And so I think like there's an old way of thinking about things, and with that new way, I think that's where countries are going to have to reconsider where they're not actually representing the interest of their own people.
Awesome.
One question.
Anyone? Yes, I was gonna say, I was gonna open it up. Go ahead.
So thank you, Professor Ahmad, for your presentation. And how do you see the future concerning the expansion of IRENA and its universalization, knowing that the regional organizations like the African Union, the Organization of American States, have developed over time competencies on energy transition, climate energy, and also the other part of the question, what are the risks of overlapping the action of IRENA with that of new international organization like the UN Energy and sustainable energy for all?
Yeah, thank you. And so, yeah, I think that's a really important question because what I saw also is there was this epistemic concern about why IRENA was formed. Like there was the idea that don't we already have organizations put in place at the UN to really address these issues? But at the same time, there isn't that level of cooperation as well as input that is accepted the same way. I remember at one IRENA meeting I was at, India decided it was going to form its own solar like regional pact. And there was concerns from a couple of European countries, including the UK and Germany, that why would India want to form its like a solar cooperative initiative, like a regional, when we already have those systems in place in Europe. And so I think they felt that they were taking away their idea, and that like India didn't have the capacity to be able to develop like solar panels and spread them out in the ways that they could in Germany or the UK. And so I think there's part of that, like how could these people even know what they're doing? But we're also seeing that the deployment of renewables is far more rapid in some of these areas. So for example, like Akon, the rapper, I don't know how many are familiar with him, Akon had gone through this whole initiative called Akon Lighting Africa. And so he decided that that on his own, like through his own networks, he was going to electrify, his goal was to electrify 1 million homes, and that he would go through this process. And so he went very seriously, and he met with, like if you think about it, maybe it seems funny, but he was actually like doing it very seriously. He went and met with like the presidents of like 7 different African countries and told them this is what we want to do, and they were all on board with the idea. And so he was able to really work. And so then his goal was, you know, if we have 1 million, we have 1 million panels, 1 million people who are receiving energy, then we want to go to our next goal. And so his idea was, okay, how can we get like 600 million people? Like, and so if you go see the leap from like from 0 to 1 million is big, but it maybe from 1 to 600 million is not as far-fetched anymore when that leap happens. And then in Africa, you also see areas that had no electricity, as well as no telecommunication networks, can actually overnight deploy those systems. You can have areas that had no landlines have mobile phones and satellite technology, and then areas that had no electricity have solar panels put in place. And so that improves the outcomes, not only for the area, it increases the economic time span of when work can happen. It also improves the security, especially for women who are traveling in the nighttime, in terms of how they can move around more freely. And especially like right now is considered like this century is considered like the Asian century in terms of how, but the next century will really be the African century in terms of like where development will be happening. And then so I think it's important to see like how these shifts are happening and how that can be really unsettling in some ways.
Thank you. Anyone in the audience have any questions? We have 1 minute or so left. All right, going once, twice. Looks like we're great. And look, we ended perfectly right on time. So thank you so much for a really brilliant discussion. I really appreciate it. It was great seeing you. Sorry we couldn't be in person, but it was amazing seeing you at least virtually. So have a great one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so
Everything will be available on our website. So we will make sure we get it posted. Thank you.
Yes.